Could former President Trump actually imprison his former opponent, VP Kamala Harris, if he wins a second term? Okay, I know what you're thinking. It sounds a little out there, right? Like something out of a movie? Maybe. But this Judicial Times article, it really got me thinking. It connects some dots that, frankly, are pretty worrying if you're concerned about the future of, well, democracy, really.
Yeah.
And since we're all about digging deeper here, I thought, who better to unpack this with than you?
Happy to dive in. It's definitely a headline grabber. I mean, imprisoning a former opponent, it sounds extreme, right?
To say the least.
But what's concerning is that with Trump, there's often a pattern of rhetoric turning into action, or at least attempts at action.
Right.
Remember the lock her up chants back in 2016 aimed at Hillary Clinton throughout the entire campaign?
Oh, how could anyone forget? It was practically inescapable.
Exactly. And while thankfully those chants didn't lead to actual charges against Clinton,
Right.
the situation now feels different,
Yeah.
Trump's facing his own legal battles, and that, I think, changes the dynamic considerably.
You think it might make him more likely to use the Justice Department aggressively if he gets back in power?
It's a possibility. The article highlights how, even during his first term, there were attempts to pressure the DOJ to go after his rivals.
And on the flip side, he used pardons to protect his allies, like what happened with Michael Flynn.
Exactly. So there's a precedent there. And now you have Harris in the crosshairs. Trump's accusing her of enabling immigration crime, mismanaging justice, the whole 9 yards.
And he often backs those accusations up with, how do we put this delicately?
With information that's often misleading.
At best.
Yeah.
Or just plain false.
Yeah, like that claim that Harris allowed 13,099 convicted murderers into the country.
Which PolitiFact completely debunked, by the way.
Right. Completely baseless. But again, it fits a pattern, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Trump branding his rivals as criminals. It plays into his law and order image, which resonates with a good portion of his base.
And Harris, being the first female VP, a woman of color, she becomes a particularly potent target for that kind of rhetoric.
Absolutely. It allows him to tap into existing anxieties, whether they're based in reality or not. And that's what makes this so concerning. It's not just about Harris. It's about the erosion of norms, about what it means for the future of American democracy.
It's like a stress test for the entire system.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about why Trump might have it out for Harris. But what about the how? Like, if he actually gets elected again, is that something he could actually pull off?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, accusing someone is one thing. Actually bringing charges, making those charges stick, that's a whole other ballgame.
It is.
And this is where the article gets really interesting because it talks about how Trump could potentially try to weaponize the Department of Justice.
Oh, boy.
That's the real fear here, right?
Yeah.
That he could try to manipulate the system to go after his enemies.
So you're talking about like firing the current people at the DOJ and replacing them with people who are loyal to him.
Yep. Loyalists who might be more willing to do his bidding, let's say.
Who would be more likely to pursue charges against his opponents.
Potentially, yeah. And that's a terrifying thought.
It's giving me serious House of Cards vibes, not gonna lie.
Right. And that's exactly why this is such a big deal. It's not just about Trump and Harris.
Right.
It's about the integrity of our entire judicial system.
Exactly.
It raises these really troubling questions about whether the legal system can be used as a tool for political revenge.
Which undermines the very idea of a democracy.
Precisely.
If presidents can just use the DOJ to silence their critics, then we're in serious trouble.
Absolutely.
And it's not just hypothetical either.
No.
The article actually goes on to list some of the specific charges Trump might try to bring against Harris.
Right. Like, none of them seem particularly strong legally, but it's not really about that, is it?
No, I guess not.
It's about creating a pretext, laying the groundwork for legal action, even if those actions are ultimately baseless.
So what kind of charges are we talking about here?
Well, he's gone after her pretty hard on immigration, right?
Yeah.
Blaming her for the border crisis, suggesting she's been negligent in her duties.
Even though, to be fair, she inherited a complete mess at the border.
Exactly. But again, it's about controlling the narrative.
Right.
So the article suggests he might try to push for dereliction of duty charges.
Seriously.
Or argue that she knowingly allowed criminals into the country.
Come on, that seems like a bit of a stretch.
It does. But again, it's about perception.
Right. Create the perception of wrongdoing, even if it's not actually there.
Exactly.
Okay, so immigration, that's one. What else?
Well, another area is the whole COVID-19 pandemic response.
Yes, of course.
Trump's been highly critical of how the Biden administration handled the pandemic.
Which is kind of ironic considering he was literally in charge for a good chunk of it.
Right. But that hasn't stopped him from throwing out accusations. The article mentions potential charges related to things like mask mandates, vaccine policies.
Wow, so using a global pandemic that affected literally everyone as a political weapon?
Essentially, yes.
Man, this is getting dark.
Yeah, and it gets worse.
Oh no, there's more.
There is. And this one's probably the most concerning. Election interference.
Here we go. He just can't let that one go, can he?
Apparently not. The article suggests he might try to tie Harris to his claims about election fraud.
You mean his baseless, completely debunked claims about election fraud?
Those are the ones. He might accuse her of being part of a conspiracy to steal the 2020 election.
Which is just ludicrous.
It is. But again, we've seen him do this before. It's about sowing doubt, undermining trust in our elections.
Which ultimately undermines our entire democracy.
Exactly. And then there's one final possibility the article mentions. This one's a bit more out there.
Okay, hit me with it.
Trump could try to claim that Harris's policies, her statements, maybe even just her rhetoric, were directly responsible for inciting violence or unrest.
Wait, seriously, so basically trying to silence her, make her afraid to speak out against him.
Essentially, yeah. It's a classic authoritarian tactic. Control the narrative, punish dissent.
Wow, that's pretty chilling.
It is, and it highlights just how high the stakes are here.
Yeah, no kidding. This is some scary stuff. I need a minute to process all of this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, this has been a lot. It's kind of overwhelming, honestly. Where do we even go from here?
Right. I mean, it's heavy stuff. But it's not all doom and gloom, thankfully.
Oh, good. Because I could really use a little good news right now.
Well, the article does point out that there are some pretty significant obstacles in Trump's way. Like, our system isn't exactly designed to let presidents just settle scores, right?
Right. We have checks and balances for a reason.
Exactly. Our government is specifically set up to prevent this kind of abuse of power. Any charges against Harris, especially if they seem politically motivated.
Which, let's be honest, they probably would.
Right. They'd face intense scrutiny from the courts. Like, serious legal challenges.
So the courts would probably put a stop to anything that looked like a political witch hunt.
Exactly. Especially since, let's be real, the basis for a lot of Trump's accusations, it's pretty weak. Plus, Harris isn't exactly powerless here.
That's true. She's the former vice president.
Yeah.
That's got to account for something, right?
Absolutely. She has the weight of that office,
Oh.
the connections, the resources. Successfully going after someone like that, that's not easy.
Okay, so that does make me feel a little better.
Good.
But I gotta be honest, it's still unnerving. Just the fact that this is even a conversation we're having.
I hear you. It's a sign of how tense things have become, for sure.
Right? It's like the guardrails are still there, but they're looking a little shaky.
I think that's a good way to put it. And it's not just the possibility, right? It's the suggestion. The rhetoric itself has an impact.
Because even if it's just bluster, it still erodes trust.
Exactly. And it's not just happening here in the U.S. We're seeing this globally. Leaders trying to use the legal system to silence their opponents, to hold on to power. It's a dangerous trend.
So where does that leave us? What are we supposed to do with all of this?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is this. We can't take our democracy for granted. We have to be vigilant, call out abuses of power when we see them. And we have to defend the institutions that protect us, the courts, the free press, all of it.
We can't just assume it'll all work out in the end. We all have a role to play here.
I completely agree.
Well, this has been a heavy one, but I'm really glad we had this conversation. Thank you for, walking us through all of this.
Of course, anytime. Happy to help make sense of it all.
And to everyone listening, as we head into this election and beyond, I want you to consider something. What if, even if he loses, Trump keeps doing this? What if this becomes the norm? Because if that happens, it could open the door for someone even more willing to abuse their power, to actually follow through on these threats. It's a scary thought, but it's something we all need to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.